and not necessarily those of Fresh Air Incorporated, its staff, or its board of directors.
Hi, this is Al McFarland, host of The Conversation with Al McFarland. You're listening to 90.3 FM, KFAI, Minneapolis. And that voice is not just for here at 38th in Chicago, not just for George Floyd Square. It's a voice for the world. I think we have to look at legislation, look at civic engagement, look at education, at health, all the things that make us human beings, and determine that our voices matter, our lives matter. We're here to do that today. So listen, if you are with us online on Facebook or YouTube or any of the social media platforms, LinkedIn, thank you for being a part of the conversation with Al McFarland. Of course, we thank all of our listeners here on KFAI. And I want to begin by actually acknowledging some of the partners that make this program possible. We're calling this day 2 of Amplified Voices Global Impact. And the idea is that we're going to do a critical set of community conversations live right here in George Floyd Square. So we have wonderful sponsors. A couple of them I want to mention today. St. Paul Neighborhood Network is doing the filming and production. Speak Minneapolis is carrying this program live, just as is KFAI, and we are also streaming live to Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. We want to thank a couple of businesses and organizations that support this project. One is Kowalski Supermarket. Thank them for their support. And we want to thank the people over at the Minnesota Cultural Heritage Center for their support as well. I want to pay particular thanks to the production crew today: Tajuddin Ali, Melik Saeed, Emma DeBoer, Sabrina Ford Rambo, and operating remotely for the conversation with Al McFarland, our producer, Jared McMullen. So thanks to all of them. So today's discussion, as I said, focuses on justice, on public policy, on civic trust, on legal reform, and the ongoing national conversation surrounding accountability, this 6 years after the murder of George Floyd. This conversation will explore how communities define justice today, where systems have changed, what trust remains fractured, and how leadership, law, healthcare, and civic participation continue to shape the future. My guests today are Ruth Richardson and Haley Taylor Schlitz. Let me introduce Ruth Richardson at first. Ruth Richardson is the president and CEO of Planned Parenthood North Central States. Her background: she was the first Black woman to lead this organization, Planned Parenthood, in its 100-plus year history. She's a former Minnesota House of Representatives representing St. Paul, I believe.
Mendota Heights.
Mendota Heights, okay. And She's passed more than 50 bills that were signed into law during her legislative term. She's been a strong advocate for health care access, for equity and community empowerment. Ruth Richardson, thank you and welcome to the conversation with Al McFarland. Thanks for coming again. You've been here before. We have a partnership that we treasure, we value. But today, I want to have you, since we're here at George Floyd Square, think back to where you were when you first heard about the murder of George Floyd Square, to when you first saw the video. What hit you? Where were you? What did you think? What did you do?
Yeah, that brings back a lot of memories. And thank you for having me for this really important conversation. So I was actually at home when I saw the video. I was sitting on my couch and I was on Twitter. And as I had been scrolling through Twitter, I had seen a note from the Minneapolis Police Department that someone had died while in police custody from a medical emergency. And shortly after that, I saw the video that Darnella Frazier had uploaded.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, everything stopped. It was a really heavy moment. And it was also one of like deep compounded trauma as well. Because I know with the killing of George Floyd, like around the world, there was sort of this like outpouring and this outcry in that moment. But for many within our communities who have been in this space before, it was a layered, compounded trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I thought about folks like Philando Castile. I thought about my own cousin who was killed by law enforcement. He was shot in the back in front of my mother while he was running for his life. And there was no video for that. And so there was this moment of intense like grief and pain and a heaviness that really settled around me. And I was pacing back and forth in my living room with just that grief and that anger and not knowing quite how to channel that. And being within the legislature at the time, I really started to think about what was within my power to try to do within that moment. And that was the beginnings of writing House Resolution 1, declaring racism a public health crisis. We were in COVID and everything had stopped because the governor, the Speaker of the House, and also the head of the Senate had said, we're not going to pass any bills unless they have to do with COVID because people are dying. And at that point, 2 people had died and everything had stopped in Minnesota. And I really reflected on the fact that people have been dying for centuries because of racism. And we've never stopped and said, we're going to stop and do everything that we can because we have to do something because people are dying. And so that was the impetus for creating the House Select Committee on Racial Justice. And what followed was really work with community, for community to come to the Capitol to say, this is what we need, as opposed to be told what they need. And a lot of those 83 recommendations have have become law since then.
I'm Al McFarland. This is The Conversation with Al McFarland. We're broadcasting live from George Floyd Square. We are pleased to be at the Worldwide Outreach Center at 3808 Worldwide Outreach Christ Ministries. Let me say it the right way. Worldwide Outreach for Christ Ministries. And we're here at 3808 Chicago Avenue South. We're pleased to be in this wonderful sanctuary. It's a great place to use as a studio. We're on hallowed ground. We're in a sacred space, and we are honored to be here. And we thank you. If you're in the community, you want to drop in, join the conversation, we invite you to just drop in. We're informal that way, and we'd love to have your voice. If you're listening on social media, on Facebook or on YouTube, you can put your voice in play here simply by going to the comment section. Let us know where you're listening from and what questions you may have, what concerns you may have, what statements you want to make. It's important that we communicate. So I'm monitoring the live stream now. And again, connect with us. Let us know that you're listening. Tell some people that this conversation is happening right now. I'm speaking with Ruth Richardson, who's president and CEO of Planned Parenthood North Central States and a former legislator. She talked about where she was, what she did. Ruth, a couple of things I want to do is, you told this story before, but this is personal to you. It's personal for all kinds of reasons, but maybe chief among them is that you said your own family member was a victim of police violence. Tell that story and how that story sort of informs your assessment of what has happened here.
Yeah, so my mom was actually at my aunt's house, and she was just getting ready to leave. They had spent the evening together, and she was heading out of the apartment building when she saw my cousin running down the street. She saw him
What city, what town?
in St. Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And she saw him get shot. She saw him fall. There was a lot of commotion and yelling, and people were told to get back into the apartment building. And one of the things that really stuck with me from the story that she told is that when paramedics got there, my cousin was still alive,
Mm-hmm.
but they hadn't brought a stretcher because from her perspective, she assumed that they hadn't been told that he was still alive. And so she watched them carry him with his hands and feet to the ambulance.
Mm-hmm.
We rushed down to the hospital, to Regents in St. Paul, and I will never forget the my cousin whose son this was like inconsolable.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was trying to console her, and I wasn't prepared for any of that. I was really young at the time, and I was struck by how disrespectfully my family was being treated in that moment as we were grieving. It was like there was just like the basic humanity of recognizing that there are people here that are grieving and people here that are in pain. And there was almost this attempt to sort of like escalate a conflict because we were told, you need to leave the hospital, and like, you need to leave the hospital right now, or you're going to be arrested. And that just that is something that has stayed with me for many years. It was just like, it really felt like just like baseline humanity wasn't being recognized.
Almost as if the entire family was being penalized or criminalized for being there with compassion for a loved one who had been injured in hospital. And you're saying not only did that feeling come from maybe the officers involved, but the institution, the caregivers as well. And that is a problem. And so what does it mean that Black bodies are not valued? When you think back about your training, your education, your work history, and your experiences, what is your assessment about the challenges and the risk we face just by being?
I think it's a really important question. And frankly, I think if we had a baseline understanding that everyone's humanity is
Mhm.
recognized, we would be in a very different place than we are right now. And even at the time, being in the legislature when we were navigating through police reform and other recommendations that came up as part of the House Select Committee on racial justice, we talked a lot and we heard a lot about the need to be colorblind
Mhm.
within our approach to legislation and within the approach to any strategies that we would have from a legislative perspective. And I will never forget in our first meeting talking about the fact that we haven't gotten to this place by being colorblind. And I don't think we're going to get out of this
Right.
place by being colorblind. And it really, I think, set the stage to have some conversations at the Capitol in a way and with a depth that they hadn't been had
Mhm.
before. And just in terms of thinking of even like one concrete thing that came out of that. Today I'm wearing this pin,
Mhm.
and this pin is representative of the Office for Missing Murdered Black Women and Girls.
Mhm.
Right, that was one of the recommendations that came forward from community
Mhm.
as part of this House Select Committee on Racial Justice, and now it exists. And now, not only does it exist in Minnesota, but I was just in Nebraska yesterday.
Mhm.
They just created a task force. Missouri has created a task force. They have a bill to create an office. Wisconsin is doing this as well, North Carolina. And so I think within these spaces, it's about the work that needs to be done. You can't solve for something that you're not willing to measure. You
Mhm.
can't solve for something that you're not willing to talk about. And that, I think, has been some of the most important work that has come out of tragedy.
Mhm.
And I always remind people that many of these bills that came to be, even the Office for Missing Murdered Black Women and Girls, I had introduced a bill for a task force
Mhm.
a year before George Floyd was killed, and I
Mhm.
couldn't get a hearing. Not in the House, not in the Senate. And after that, that's when I finally got this hearing
Mhm.
for this office. Finally got a hearing for the Dignity in Pregnancy and Childbirth Act, and I could go down like these list of bills that you couldn't even get people to just have a conversation
Mhm.
about.
Mhm.
Ending racism and organ transplants. It's like all of these things happen, and someone had to like die in
Mhm.
order for those conversations to start. And that's why, again, I go back to if we could just get back to the basic recognition of humanity, we'd be in a better place.
Well, you mentioned you couldn't solve for something that you can't measure, nor can you solve something that you won't name,
Correct.
that you won't exist. And so
Ex-
it leads to the question of how we as a community, as a country, have approached or failed to approach the existence of the problem. The problem is the devaluation of our humanity and a willingness to ignore what the culture, the society, the history has done that is evil in the uh, bondage, the enslavement, the murder, the theft of our life and our liberty, the theft of our possessions,
Yes.
and that theft as state policy,
Yes.
the government, the Constitution embedded the idea of our being counted as property for someone else's benefit. So that's the context.
Yeah.
And so what do we do? So I raised the question because we can keep pointing that out and keep challenging them, and that's white culture, I'll put it that way. Ultimately, uh, we can't depend on them. I think we have to depend on us. And that's what I want you to get to
Yeah.
is how do we come into it? But, at the same time,
Yeah.
we cannot ignore that they exist. And I think that the we we're talking about is bigger than just us. It's the we of justice.
Mhm.
That we includes every human being.
That's right.
It even is a we that includes more than humans. It includes all living things. It's a we that includes more than all living things. It includes the sentient and the non-sentient. It includes the material, mineral assets of the planet, and it requires us to have a different relationship, one that is not extractive, but one that is regenerative. I'm saying a lot.
Yeah.
I'm saying a lot, but I'm going to drop it back on you and respond to that. And we're going to introduce another voice in just a second.
Well, as you were saying that, there were two things that came to mind. One, when you think about the unfulfilled promise
Mhm.
of this nation, I think about my great great grandfather. I've been working to build my family's tree. And one of the things that really struck me is looking out 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865. I'm looking at the census records for my great great grandfather, and I can see that he was a sharecropper,
Mhm.
that he worked 6 days a week, and he worked 10 hours a day. And his income after a year of working in the fields was $0. And I was able to also see
What year? You know, roughly?
this was 1870. So
Okay.
this was 5 years
After.
after the Emancipation Proclamation.
Mhm.
And I was able to also find the family that owned him.
Hmm.
And so I wanted to look at their census records, and I wanted to see their net worth. And looking 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, their wealth in today's money was $50,000. And so juxtapose that and seeing those two differences, I think really frames up the question and the way that you asked it. There's no Calvary that is coming
That's
to
right.
save us.
That's it.
And in the spaces of the reproductive justice movement, it is clear we are the people that we have been waiting for.
Mhm.
And that, I think, was also really clear in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. And we started to have some conversations at the Capitol that we had not had before. But I want to be really clear that we were doing like baseline things
Mhm.
that shouldn't have been fights in the first place.
Mhm.
The right to give birth with the dignity and humanity recognized is not something that you should have to put into the law, but we do, right? Thinking about things like the organ transplant piece that I was just talking to you about. I was at the doctor a week ago, and she was talking to me about my kidney functioning, and she's like, "Your EGFR is normal." And I looked at her and I said, "Did you use the Black coefficient to calculate that?"
Mhm.
And she looked at me and she said, "Oh, we don't do that anymore. We stopped doing that 3 years ago." And I'm glad that we did. And I said, "Did you know that you stopped doing that because I wrote a bill that said that you couldn't do that anymore?" And she was shocked by that. But again, to the point that you are making, there's no one that is coming to save us. And so really starting to think about how community is working together. And I think that is not only about doing the work within legislatures or within the courts, but also thinking about the ways that community is supporting each other.
I'm going to ask you when I come back around to talk about health equity and how that's evolved since 2000 and what connections you see between community trauma and public health. And I want you to focus too, think about this on how important representation and leadership is when we're trying to rebuild public trust and what systems in our government still need the most urgent reform. I'm Al McFarland. This is The Conversation with Al McFarland. We're broadcasting live today from George Floyd Square. We're calling this George Floyd Week, and we're happy to be at the Worldwide Outreach for Christ Ministries at 3808 Chicago Avenue South. We invite you to drop in if you're in the neighborhood. We'll be here all day, well, all day till for the program today. We're also broadcasting tomorrow, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And we'd love to have you be part of this, either in the live audience, but certainly we appreciate that you're connecting with us on the KFAI airwaves and on social media. We're streaming live to LinkedIn, to YouTube, and to Facebook. My next guest is an Insight columnist, but also a Star Tribune columnist and writing for national publications like the Hub News and others. She's an attorney, an educator, an author, a public speaker. She's a thought leader on equity in education and opportunities for students of color. She is a contributor to, as I said, a variety of media outlets, including the Minnesota Star Tribune, the Hub News, and Insight News, and she brings a strong perspective on law, policy, and civic systems and representation. She happens to have been one of the youngest lawyers, young women to pass the bar in the country. I can't believe that she's just 23 years old right now, and she's a former assistant attorney general for the state of Minnesota and now in corporate law. Haley Taylor Schlitz, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I was really excited to kind of plug in where I did and hear the conversation that you were having coming from work. To be able to jump into this is really, I wouldn't rather be anywhere else.
Well, you often present yourself, and I present you as a Gen Z Black woman. And I think I want to start with that. And I think I want to start with asking you, as you reflected on the death of George Floyd, and from the lens of being a Gen Z Black woman, how does the world look? I know that you have a personal family story as well. I want you to share that about the trauma visited on your family. So this is personal for you as well.
It is.
So go ahead.
It is, and I appreciate that space. I'll start with the Gen Z piece. This is something that we grew up watching. We if you were in Minnesota when his murder occurred, it was on your streets, and otherwise it was on your TVs, it was on your social media feeds. It's something that we've grown up talking about, seeing, witnessing, something that shaped us. Same with the administrations that we have had throughout our childhood too. So I really think that this, George Floyd's murder, along with several other murders that we've seen of the African American community, and also just the decisions by the recent administration in the last year and the last 2 years have really shaped our passion for public policy, our passion for civil rights and civic engagement, turning out to vote. Of course, we see the numbers that Gen Z is turning out to vote in astonishing records and those kinds of things. This is what we've grown up with. I also think there's a sense on the other side of the same coin of normalizing this almost in a way. Social media has a really unique and special trait of making things fast in the world. So the murder is on your screen, and you scroll, and the next thing is like a get ready with me for like prom, and it's the same exact feed, the same exact minute that you're transitioning between something horrific to something normal and mundane. And so I really think that also shapes Gen Z, and especially Gen Alpha too, as they grow up on the same technology we did, shaping this into, building off of what you guys are talking about. There's not going to be a savior, ringing a bell, with some lights here for us, so seeing how normal this has been for Gen Z, school shootings, those kinds of things, just violence from law enforcement, and especially related to weapons, that being normalized, I think will, it sounds like a very negative thing, that it's normalized for Gen Z, but normalized in a way where it's, thoughts and prayers don't go as far as maybe they used to, or maybe they do for other communities. It really is like, this is our lived experience. My friends died in these hallways. Your thoughts and prayers are not enough. And so there is that. And then to touch on the second piece of your question about kind of the family trauma that surfaces on anniversaries like this one. my mother's father, so my grandfather, I never got a chance to meet him because he was the second person killed in the Rodney King civil unrest. And so it's been decades since, but within the same season. And so every single time that, anniversary comes around, that same level of trauma, but also perseverance, especially from my grandmother, being a single mother, raising my mother on her own. And even when she remarried and had my uncles and aunts, still bringing that into the space where we continue to share his story, and how he was a phenomenal basketball player and he was on his way home from the grocery store and never made it home. And that is the story of a lot of African Americans, a lot of Black men who don't make it home, and that's part of what informed my parents, and a lot of African American families, the conversation around making it home. You get pulled over, just make it home. And so, that again, the murderer George Floyd being also, a yearly anniversary, sitting in this space and reflecting on how similar it is to my family story, but also how unfortunately similar it is to millions, of families across the country over the years, and really how close to home this is as a community.
I didn't ask you, Ruth, but I'm going to ask you both to say the names of the loved ones that you lost. I think we owe that to them, and we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to the ancestors to acknowledge them.
Right. His name was Dwight Taylor.
Demetrius Hill.
Okay, thank you for saying that. Haley, so how do students and families experience and feel the ripple effects of any inequity today? You've answered that a little already by saying that we are sort of at one level anesthetized, flowing information all the time, and you don't have a chance to really meditate on the weight of different things. But what does that mean for, as you see it, students in particular and families?
And I think I've seen that. Like I was a fifth grade social studies teacher, so in Texas, so that adds a layer too. But fifth grade social studies in Texas is American history. So starting all the way back from our founding to Barack Obama, 9/11, kind of what is considered like modern day history that's being made for students who were potentially even alive to see a lot of that happen. And so I have seen the way that these kinds of events shape the conversations that are happening in classrooms with students, and of course in turn at home with families and parents, and especially parents who are teachers and so forth. And so having those conversations with my students, they were 10, 11. So that's when the conversations, I won't say start, because they do happen at home too, but especially in the classroom and the curriculum, that is a lot of where they find out about the history and the brutality. And
tell me about that. I'm asking because I've got an 11-year-old grandson.
Yes.
And I know that, and I remember thinking back to when I was 12, and that was a long, long time ago, but I remember being particularly conscious of the world at that time.
Right.
And I don't think I was that extraordinary. I think the kids in my group had a sense of the national politics and the global politics, the Cold War. We were trained to, in case of a nuclear event, crawl under your desk.
Yeah,
that wasn't going to help.
Right. If the bomb came, crawl under your desk. That was the story at that time. but the point I'm making is that 9, 8, 10, 12 years old children are aware.
Right.
And they have libraries at their disposal in their telephones and iPads. So how do we understand this difference for them and support their growth, their knowledge, their protection, but have real conversations? What do you think?
And I think that, that's the irony of book banning. I'll just plug that in, with how accessible everything is on phones, tablets, computers, and especially, Gen Alpha, Gen Z being very tech savvy, being able to switch between tabs. There's no limit on information, but there's also no limit on mis and disinformation too. And so having that balance for students, I've noticed, has been a very, very intentional walk, because again, as the social studies teacher, showing them images of the slave boats, showing them the stories of how this was not that long ago, although the pictures are in black and white. Some of these people that we're learning about in history books have TikTok accounts. Like, it's not as disconnected as sometimes they try to present intentionally that it is. And so definitely, as it is from the teacher's perspective and also from the Gen Z perspective, so I brought that duality to the classroom for my fifth graders, understanding this is the walk. We're walking the line of balance between information, but also the mis and disinformation that's being spread. I do want to say that I think that Gen Z is also very connected to politics and what's happening right now. As you're saying with your generation, I think that each generation obviously comes of age in their own environment and they're plugged into that. And so kind of what I was alluding to earlier was that Gen Z has grown up with, the switch from, and if they were, because Gen Z ranges from I don't know, like sixth grade to 28 years old. So you definitely are getting like that kind of spectrum right now and where we are in our lives and development. So you have some Gen Z who, weren't alive when, Barack Obama was president, only have seen Trump in their own memory. And some Gen Z who have truly seen the transition from the first Black president to, Trump and how that looks comparatively, and really plugged in different ways. And I think that's a really interesting, take for Gen Z.
Let me ask you both. So, does it mean that conversations about race and opportunity have become harder to have publicly, or not? What do you think?
I don't think so. I'll just plug in, and I want to hear from you and hear what you were saying earlier too. But my brother, he's 21 now, and he actually has friends that are all over the world. So a lot of the things that you could only get through intentional, filtered voices that happen to have stages and a microphone, and tell you the story they want you to hear, is a lot less the case in reality now. My brother, like I said, he has friends all over the world that are telling him in real time, this is what our streets look like. This is what the war looks like. This is what our law enforcement looks like. And being able to have that interconnectedness, I think, amplifies in some ways the conversation of race and the conversation we're having today in George Floyd Square, again, with the balance of mis and disinformation too.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, we saw lots of people coming out and saying things like Black Lives Matter. And in 2020, I was asking the question, if that's the first time that you can say Black Lives Matter, do they really matter? And also a lot of organizations that made a lot of pledges and promises. Right. And so is it harder to talk about? I would say, I don't know that I can put a opinion on whether it's harder, but people are talking about it less than they were in 2020. And I also think that with...
Let me ask you this. Yeah. People, them or us? Who's and it may be us as well.
Well, look, I'm not going to paint any any one group with one brush, but I do think that we are in a space where I see in some circles people are talking less about issues. And
I mean, here's what I'm hearing, Ruth.
Yeah.
I'm hearing that people in my circle telling me that people are tired of talking about George Floyd, that George Floyd is history, it's old news, and that all of the energy and all of the angst and all of the drive now has been either is going to be ignored or deflected or otherwise, pushed back to the margin because there isn't a demand. I mean, so you said earlier, Ruth, that there were questions that had not been raised or problems that hadn't been addressed because, you can't measure or count. And I said, and they won't be addressed if you refuse to acknowledge that they exist. Are we moving back to that arena again? That's the question I have, and I'm afraid that we are, but hopefully I'm wrong.
Well, I think with people who are doing this work and staying resolved, we don't have to move. We don't have to move back. And I also think there's sort of two things here. You can't, I talked about how you can't solve for things that you can't measure. we didn't know in this state how many cold cases we had for Black women and girls that were missing. Now we have data that is that we are building and continuing to do that on. We also weren't tracking the data on the Black coefficient that would keep people that look like us from getting on kidney transplant lists anywhere from 4 to 6 years. So we were dying at a higher rate on kidney transplant lists because they were adding points to our kidney functioning score to make it look like our kidneys were operating better than they actually were. So measuring, talking about like what the issues are, I think to your point is incredibly important. And yeah, I think there is a level of people being tired of having conversations on both sides of on both sides of these issues. But I think it's really narrow to just talk about it from the perspective of what happened in 2020, because before 2020, there was your grandfather.
Right.
Before 2020, there was my cousin. And then and we can go back to like Emmett Till and others. And so to narrow this down to just sort of one moment, the fight that we are in, it's not a moment. Like this, I mean, this is
a movement.
yeah. And this is what you have to do in every single generation
Right.
because it's an orientation of your spirit, not like, okay, we got everything that we need. We can check the boxes off and we're done.
Because all the boxes are being unchecked right now at the Supreme Court
Right.
and by legislative action or by fiat from the president's desk.
You have to fight in every single successive generation,
Right.
because freedom is never truly won. Coretta Scott King told us that, and she was right.
And Haley, here's what I take from you just over our conversations over the past year. There's a sense of ownership that is natural for you. I think that there is not a sense of they can stop us. I think you don't operate from that framework at all. You operate from a framework that says, this is what I see, what I know, and what I will say, and what I will do. And then I see you operating with a clarity and a conviction, a fierceness that simply says step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and it is focused. Is that abroad in our community, or is that the exception? And if it's the exception now, how do we make it the standard operating procedure for being a Black person to begin with, but to be a human being broadly? What do you think?
I think that's an interesting question, especially in the space and conversation we're having, because I think it's a little of both. I think people get comfortable, and maybe like building off of what you were saying, people think 2020, is history, and you see the same thing with like cancel culture, canceled for a while, you make your point, and then you slowly start shopping there again. You slowly start listening to music again. And again, I think it goes back to the fast paced world of technology. But to answer your question, I think in those moments of crisis and those moments of like emergency response, and we've seen people have that step 1, step 2, organize this protest, turn out to vote at this election, and we see that momentum sometimes lost over the course of years or months or days or whatever have you. And so I think it is a mix of both. I don't think that the capability is not there. I do think that, like you said, that orientation of this is who you are and this is the fight that will continue to happen every day. Having that mentality is something that is continuously shaped from generation to generation, which is why I always think intergenerational connectedness and conversations are crucial, because Gen Z doesn't have that muscle memory. Gen Alpha doesn't have that muscle memory. The things that you've gone through, the things that you've seen, those are the stories that need to be told. That orients the spirit, So I think it's a little of both. Yeah.
More to that, Ruth?
Yeah.
Let me take this back to your present work. I want to connect, the work that you do every day now to the mission, the movement, and to human dignity. I think that's at the core. Talk about what you do at Planned Parenthood and what the issues are, the principles are, how they relate to this conversation.
Sure. So, Planned Parenthood North Central States is made up of 5 states: Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and Nebraska. And we provide a full range of sexual and reproductive health care. People mostly think about us because we provide abortion care, but we also provide access to contraception, STI testing and treatment, cancer screenings, vasectomies, some primary care services, fertility treatments, menopause care, and mental health services. So we provide a diverse range of services. And as I think about this conversation and the work that we do within Planned Parenthood, be it our healthcare, our research, the advocacy work that we do, and the education work, what's really important, and our North Star is health equity. That's the North Star of our organization, but it's also a recognition of a lot of the principles that you think about within the reproductive justice movement. People have the right to have a child, not to have a child, and if they have a child, to raise them in a safe and sustainable community. And those are things that I think are important pieces of the conversation that we are having. You talked about the slave trade, and and talked about like my own family who was enslaved as well. There wasn't that choice, right? And even thinking about when the slave trade, when they stopped allowing the slave trade to happen, the thought process was, now what are we going to do in the US to ensure that we have a steady supply of free work? And that was that meant that there was no bodily autonomy for Black folks that were enslaved.
And the process was basically animal husbandry.
Correct.
Where they had people in situations to produce children to be enslaved forever.
And then you can fast forward to the Emancipation Proclamation, and and then we could have a whole conversation about Juneteenth and all of those things. But even then, within our Constitution, we still protected access to slavery and to ensuring that people were enslaved. We called it incarceration then, right? And then we talked about the fact that with the Black codes, laws came into play like vagrancy. So if you're over the age of 18 and you didn't have a means to be able to support yourself, you could be considered a vagrant, you could be arrested, and now you are once again free labor for the state. Do you know when the state of Minnesota got rid of the vagrancy laws that were on the books? It wasn't that long ago. It was back in maybe 2006.
Okay.
Early 2006. And I know that because when I was in law school, I was working with a group of people to try to get the vagrancy laws off of the books, because you see the ways that on one hand, you're thinking like, okay, we have the Emancipation Proclamation. We are now done. It's like, no, there's a whole new system that has been set up. And even when people were incarcerated, if there was a child that was born to someone who was incarcerated, that child was owned by the state, and that was free labor for the state as well.
These bring two stories to mind for me. One is that I remember listening to WPA, World War II stories. They had audiographers, I guess is the right word for it, going around collecting the stories of people that had been enslaved that were still alive. And I just remember this one person that was being interviewed. This must have been in the 30s or 40s that the interview was done, with the man had been born enslaved, and the interviewer was asking, what was it like when you were a slave? Who did you work for? Or kind of act like, kind of job did you have? And the person who was interviewed, was kind of saying, what? What kind of job did I have? I was a slave, and I worked all day and all night and forever, and had no promise of ever being anything but a slave. That's a horrible condition. And then I think, when I was the board chair of the Minneapolis Urban League, Scott Gray and I went and we were trying to get some support from Hennepin County. And we talked to the executive, or not the president of Hennepin County Board. And, we came in representing a legacy institution based in North Minneapolis. And this guy set the meeting up by saying, our community has already dumped tons of money into North Minneapolis, and I'm tired. And then you all may have all these problems, but we didn't create the problem. It's your problem, not ours. So that kind of attitude, the kind of arrogance, right? And he was dissociating himself from the legacy of all of the things that create the problems that they maintain that disadvantage us. My last thought here is that about how close this is. He was saying, forget about it to me. I have a photograph, I've said this on the air several times, on my mantle at home. And in that photograph, taken in about 1951 or 2, I think I'm 3, 4, 5 years old. I was born in 47, 5 years old. And me and my cousins are all sitting on the floor on the divan. My mother, her mother, and her mother's mother. And I remember after I went to see the movie 12 Years a Slave, I came back home, and for some reason that photograph caught my eye. I picked it up and thought about my mother's mother's mother, my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother was born as the property of another human being. And what settled in my spirit was, you want me to forget this?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not forgetting it. I'm not forgetting this. A person who loved me, who held me, I actually have stories of me and that woman in Mississippi where they lived, just being in the house. And so this is my lived experience. I cannot forget it.
And it's also in your DNA.
Right.
Absolutely.
Like that that doesn't go away.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Exactly.
I asked you both to, well, I asked you, Ruth, earlier to think about these questions. And so talk about the connection between community trauma and public health. And why is it important that we focus on representation and leadership regarding rebuilding public trust? What do you think?
Well, the representation piece is one that I think is really important. And we would have this conversation a lot at the Capitol when I was there, and would talk about the importance of representation. And it's not representation for representation's sake, but because we know that it actually saves people's lives. And I would oftentimes point to the research to try to make my points, the public health research. When we look at the data, we know, for example, for Black women and looking at maternal mortality outcomes, that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from a pregnancy-related cause. And you can control for all the factors like health, nutrition, marital status, insurance status, education, socioeconomic status, substance use disorder status, more likely to die, right? But we also know that nationally, more than 84% of those deaths are preventable. And here in Minnesota, more than 95% of those deaths are preventable. And then we also were looking at really poor outcomes as it relates to infant mortality. And what we saw with the infant mortality rate of Black infants, the infant mortality rate was cut in half by infants that had a Black pediatrician. So it's an example of how representation can actually help to save people's lives. When we were able to finally ban race-based medicine as it relates to the organ transplant process, one of the things that struck me is the level of education that it took to get there. So if there wasn't someone in that space who knew about this in order to bring it
It
forward,
wouldn't be brought up.
it's something that
Yeah.
wouldn't even be discussed. It wouldn't even be brought up.
I'm Al McFarland. This is The Conversation with Al McFarland. I'm broadcasting live. We're broadcasting live from George Floyd Square. We are pleased to be here all week long. We're calling this George Floyd Week. We're at the Worldwide Outreach for Christ Ministries building here at 3808 Chicago Avenue South. We'll be here tomorrow, Thursday, and Friday as well. We invite you to drop in if you'd like to be part of the live audience. You may have a question or comment. We would welcome that. Beyond that, we thank you for listening and watching on SPNN, on Minneapolis, Speak Minneapolis, listening on KFAI, and across our social media platforms. This is an important thing that we are doing. The importance is that we need to have conversations. We need to talk about this all day, every day, and know that our conversations, our words, our thoughts, our feelings, they really matter. And we have to be really confident and sure that our voices mean power for our families, our community, and for the world. Before the program, I asked both my guests, Ruth Richardson, who's a CEO of former legislator and CEO of Planned Parenthood of Minnesota and the Northwest, I think the name, North Central States. So thank you. And Haley Taylor Slitz for some quotes that are important to them. I'm going to let you guys sort of stretch out on the quote that you sent me. Ruth, yours was that communities cannot heal fully without access, dignity, and trust within the systems meant to serve them. Talk about that. Just stretch out on it if you would.
Yeah, I think when I think about not only healing, because I don't think that you can have healing without accountability and without justice and all of those things. And so what it means to me is that we are holding a lot of contradictions at the same time. We're in this space today and we're sitting on sacred ground as you lifted up, and there's the grief that comes with that, but there's also the hope that comes with seeing like what the future can look like as well. And the dignity piece I think is important. The trust piece is also important to healing, but also the joy.
Mm.
And when things are really hard, it can be really easy to sink down into the despair of everything. But the joy is, I think, so critical. And also, just like historically, we know when you are in a space, as you talked about, in terms of our ancestors did so much more with so much less than what we have currently. And that joy was resistance in the face of like everything that they were confronting. And so I think in terms of thinking about how communities cannot fully heal without access, dignity, and trust, they also can't fully heal without embracing that joy.
Haley, your quote was, "Justice is not just about what laws exist, it's about whether communities actually experience fairness, protection, and opportunity."
Right. And I think, Al, I something I really like about your podcast and your show is how interconnected all the episodes are too.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was giving that quote, it was kind of in the same frame of mind as when we had a recent discussion about the Supreme Court and the decision regarding the Voting Rights Act. And, as an attorney, I think it's really important that especially Gen Z, hears, and, we've lived it, but hears and sees that, reform on paper is not the same as reform in reality, as reform on the streets, as reform in lives. And building off of what Ruth was saying, that is the ever going fight. And it's something that as soon as you let go, they take that. And so being mindful of just in modern day, we've seen just last month what the Supreme Court did a year or two ago with Roe v. Wade, and continuing chipping away until there's that new generation and that new push. And so that was kind of the frame of mind, coming from a Gen Z perspective, as I bring to Insight and the columns that I write. But also, this quote was in the same brain space as when we were talking about the Supreme Court, and I wrote a column on that, and I was also talking to you about it too, Al. And really seeing like, yeah, okay, the laws that we're able to win are doesn't mean reform, and also there are still a lot of laws on the books that are reflective of where we've come from, but also the people who still keep us where we're at.
Haley, I want to thank you so much. Haley Taylor Schlitz, attorney, attorney Ruth Richardson as well, right? A former attorney or still an attorney.
I still have my license.
All right. Ruth Richardson, the CEO of Planned Parenthood North Central States. What a wonderful conversation. What a great visit, a great time for us to be in community here at George Floyd Square. My thanks again to our host organization, the Worldwide Outreach for Christ Ministries at 3808 Chicago. You can join us here tomorrow, Thursday and Friday. We're continuing with our conversations around George Floyd Week. Finally, thanks again to Speak Minneapolis, to St. Paul Neighborhood Network, to KFAI Radio, and to Kowalski's for their support. Special thanks to the crew here today, Tajuddin Ali, Melik Saeed, Emma DeBoer, Sabrina Ford Rambo, and to our producer remotely, Jared McMullen. I'm Al McFarland. We will see you tomorrow.